like to talk about the West Connemara Flying Column that was formed in early 1921 and fought throughout the latter months of the Irish War of Independence until the truce in July of that year. The column fought in 3 engagements in the west of Ireland. It was composed principally of Irish-speaking men from amongst the rural poor, the labouring poor, small farmers and fishermen from the Rosmuck, Leenane and Clifden districts in the west of Ireland. Before I talk specifically about Galway and events in the west of Ireland, I just want to dwell a moment on who actually fought in the War of Independence in the west of Ireland. Well, the young, the rural and the poor were at the forefront of the War of Independence across the west. This was the War of the Young. The vast majority of fighters and leaders were in their early 20s, unmarried and from the small farmer and labouring classes. There certainly were some leaders who had third-level education and several prominent medical doctors, but a clear profile of the average recruit to the Republican movement is very apparent. There were few shopkeepers and those in the commercial and mercantile sector, for instance. Women involved in the struggle tended to come from the same background and were often the sisters of volunteers, and many actually went on to form close bonds with the men they fought with, including many of whom ended up marrying former volunteers they had struggled alongside. The profile of the average volunteer in Connemara evolved, however, as the violence of the struggle escalated throughout late 1920 and 1921, as the dangers faced by ordinary men and women grew accordingly. During this period, active recruits became younger, tougher, less likely to be married or property owning, or have regular working hours that tied them to businesses. In this respect, the flying columns that emerged across Ireland in early 1921 represented the cutting edge of the IRA campaign. Those still willing against all odds to go out against the Crown forces that risk their homes and risk their lives. So secondly, just to clarify, well, who was actually fighting who in the west of Ireland during the War of Independence? Well, the conflict essentially, though not exclusively, involved the IRA and Connemara fighting against the police, and that, as some might imagine, the British military. During the independence struggle, the British administration insisted that the IRA and Connemara were not legitimate military opponents. Therefore, the police and not the military were to be primarily responsible for defeating the IRA. From the early 1920 until the truce in July 1921, almost 14,000 men were recruited to bolster the 10,000 or so strong sitting Royal Irish Constabulary. The Black and Tans, so called due to their mixed khaki uniforms, were recruited in early 1920 and sworn in as police constables to reinforce the local police. The vast majority of recruits were veterans of World War I with extensive military experience. The upsurge in the Republican campaign, however, led to a second wave of police recruitment in July 1920 that saw the creation of an auxiliary division that operated independently of the police. While the auxiliaries were a distinct force, they generally viewed themselves as superior socially and otherwise to the Black and Tans. Republicans and the Irish public frequently made little distinction between the regular RIC, the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans, lumping them all in together as the one force. Finally then, before we begin looking at events in Galway, is the reputation of the Black and Tans deserved? The Black and Tans have rightfully gained a notorious place in modern Irish folklore for their wanton violence inflicted largely on the civilian community. The policy of carrying out reprisals against civilian communities as a means of punishing the population at large for the actions of the IRA saw many civilians terrorised, tortured and killed. Towns shot up, women assaulted and homes burned to the ground. This was particularly the case in Galway, as we shall see. The level of violence employed by the Black and Tans actually varied greatly across Connacht, and this appears to depend to a large degree on the character of the individual company of auxiliaries stationed in each county. Thus, while Roscommon and Galway, though far from the wanton violence, free of the wanton violence of the Crown forces, actually saw less brutality inflicted by the auxiliaries and others than in neighbouring Galway, which, despite having a similar Republican presence, witnessed intense series of reprisals and the killings of civilians and Republican leaders throughout the period. For instance, in a letter to be read out to all his parishioners at Mass in September 1920, the Bishop of Galway, Thomas O'Dea, denounced the persistent shooting and flinging of grenades for miles around, almost every night since the curfew began, the systematic burning of houses, destruction of property, evictions of families from their homes, the dragging of people from their beds at revolver point and forcing them to act as spies, violence against weak women and girls, and I don't know what other forms of terrorism. So, in terms of Galway, the Republican campaign involved specific attacks, sporadic attacks I should say, against the police by a relatively small force of active IRA volunteers in distinct areas that were willing to go out against the enemy. There were few militant companies in the towns, and all attacks on police took place in rural districts. As the conflict escalated, the pool of active volunteers, as I said, became smaller as the intensity of state reprisals grew more ferocious and the nature of Republican violence also demanded much more commitment. There was, however, a marked reluctance to use violence on the part of the Irish volunteers in Galway. In fact, throughout the period up until the truce, the Galway IRA killed 18 people. That is between January 1920 and the truce in July of 1921. 14 of whom were shot in the east of the country. 9 of the victims were members of the Royal Irish Constabulary who were killed on duty. 1 was an auxiliary policeman killed in Galway town, and 3 were members of the Crown Forces, leaving 5 civilians. Of the civilian fatalities, 3 were believed to be informers. 1 was the wife of a district inspector of the RIC, Eliza Blake, fatally caught in an ambush in Kilbacanty in May of 1921, and a farmer, Martin Culnan, who was shot dead accidentally in a raid for arms in Corrafin in March of 1920. So in terms of the scale of violence, then we must look also, of course, at the contribution of women, which I'll return to later in the talk. In Galway, as elsewhere, women played a crucial but underappreciated role, acting as messengers, accumulating intelligence and passing information to the volunteers on the activities of the Crown Forces and others. Margaret Broderick Nicholson, one of a small group of Republican women in Galway town, later recalled, "The job I hated the most was enticing British soldiers down to the docks in order to have them relieved of their arms by the volunteers, one of whom, an officer, happened to be my brother." Most women who supported the volunteers in terms of providing shelter, food and first aid, and who assisted in intelligence work, certainly in Galway, were not members of any organisation, but acted out of loyalty to their family and to their community and their neighbours. In this respect, details of the membership lists of Connemara provided by the Bureau of Military History, while accurate, are also misleading in that they underestimate the numbers of women involved outside of formal organisations. Their stories are amongst the least recorded and most forgotten contribution, and the rural poor were particularly overlooked in this respect. There are less than 10 Bureau of Military History witness statements taken from rural women in Connacht, out of the just under 2,000 or so statements taken in total. A lot of these statements also concern men that the women were involved with or fought alongside. So this aspect of the Republican struggle of the rural poor is completely overlooked. In terms then of control of the volunteers in Galway and elsewhere by the IRA GHQ in Dublin, direct control by the leadership of the IRA was actually weak, and the relatively low level of training and support did inhibit the capacity of the rural IRA in the West to prosecute their campaign. Popular support for their actions was largely dependent on whether the volunteers were in the ascendancy or the decline in their battle with the Black and Tans, and an ebb and flow of support between the rival institutions of the state and the revolutionary movement occurs. Even in areas where there were no attacks on the police, a boycott of the RIC represented a very effective tool of communal solidarity in the face of the criminal actions of the police. The county inspector of the RIC for West Galway, for instance, described the conditions under which his officers were working for before the arrival of the Black and Tans in early 1920 and the outbreak of more significant violence. He wrote to Dublin Castle, "The life of the police is scarcely bearable. They are shamed and boycotted, and for the most part cannot get the necessities of life unless they commandeer them. They are held up and shot at every opportunity. The order is to destroy them, and during July 2 young men were shot dead in circumstances of cruelty and treachery. The people are generally out for a republic, and they propose to get it. During the War of Independence then, Connemara, the area I'm going to focus on for the remainder of the talk, was divided into 2 battalions in August of 1920, with the East Connemara Battalion, led by Michael O'Drynon of Anspigel, and the West Connemara Battalion, initially led by Colm O'Guara of Rossmuck, later by P.J McDonnell of Leenane, leading the battalion. Meetings were frequently held at the home of West Galway Member of Parliament Pádraig O'Malley at Winter Owen, a few miles from Leenane. The O'Malley family are a very important part of this story. They were privately educated members of the family. Tomás O'Malley, who later joined the Flying Column, was actually the first professor of modern Irish at University College Galway. He'd been educated in Switzerland and elsewhere and was a distinguished scholar. His brother Pádraig was elected Member of Parliament in 1918, again in 21 and again later in 23. The O'Malleys represented an exception, being strong farmers, educated, mobile socially and otherwise. And as we'll see, the column and its leader, P.J McDonnell, were largely from much humbler stock and of Irish-speaking poor. The nucleus of this group, as we'll see, went on to form the West Connemara Flying Column in early 1921. The column initially consisted of the Leenane Company under Pádraig O'Malley, the Rossmuck Company under Colm O'Guara, who was a school teacher, the Roundstone Company under Jim King, and the Clifden Company under Gerald Bartley. This column would, as we see, go on to carry out 3 lethal attacks on the police and use their knowledge of the mountainous terrain to evade capture until the truce in July 1921. Their fatal attacks occurred at Scree in South Galway on the 6th of April. It began in Clifden, of course, on the 16th of March, as we'll see. Then Scree on the 6th of April, and then at the O'Malley homestead itself at Winter Owen on the 23rd of April. The rural character of the IRA is very evident in Galway and across Connacht, and particularly so in the West Connemara column. In this respect, the only large town in Connacht, Galway, was heavily garrisoned, and the police and military enjoyed the social life of the town, carousing in the city's many pubs without fear of attack. IRA volunteer Peter Green recalled, "Galway City was one of the most heavily garrisoned places in Ireland, and I regret to say that the enemy had a lot of sympathy from the people in the city, who were certainly not of our way of thinking." The Republican campaign in Galway then can be analysed in a number of distinct phases that broadly conform to the evolution of the movement in other active parts of the country. And what's important to note here about the emergence of the columns in late 1920, early 1921, that they essentially emerged as a defensive mechanism for young men who were unable to stay at their homes for fear of arrest, murder, reprisal and the burning of their homes. Throughout late 1920, we have a series of murders of leading IRA men across Galway. We have famously, of course, Joseph Howley, the leader of the IRA in the Oranmore district, is killed alighting from the train in Broadstone in Dublin in December 5th. We have before that, of course, the Loughnane brothers killed in October, brutally murdered, tortured and their bodies burned at Shanaglash in South Galway. But across the county, you have members taken from their homes, some senior and some less senior, and simply killed. Very few senior officers throughout the period in Galway did not have their homes burned. And this included Colm O'Guara, Pádraig O'Malley, P.J McDonnell and others. The very basic price by early 1921 of being a senior active officer in the IRA in Galway is the loss of one's home, the potential murder, harassment and brutality of one's family. And remember, women are particularly vulnerable to this kind of violence, as men can flee the homestead, they can flee the farm. Women, due to the constraints regarding care of the elderly, the sick and the young, have nowhere to run. So the columns emerge out of the chaos and darkness of the winter of 1920, where in many respects the Crown forces begin to get the upper hand against the IRA. So the IRA are reacting independently and separate from each other in the West in the formation of the columns. So, for giving an example, by the end of 1921, most senior volunteer officers were unable to stay at their homes in Galway and forced to go on the run. In this respect, the RIC noted in a memo to Dublin Castle in November, a good deal of sympathy among people with a stake in the country is due to fear, and there are indications of a return to sanity and a revulsion against Sinn Féin on the part of the more respectable people, now that the government are beginning to get a grip on the situation. As far as Galway is concerned, Sinn Féin has largely lost its power. This is perhaps an exaggeration by the police, but the focus on social class, meaning more respectable people and so on, being less sympathetic to the IRA, is certainly accurate. In this changed reality, the police reported to superiors that they were actually beginning to receive valuable information from the community for the first time on the activity of the volunteers in Galway. The police claimed the feeling towards police is much better, with the people inclined towards friendship now, and there is no attempt anywhere to boycott them. I have received bona fide information of 2 or 3 ambushes prepared for the police. So by the winter of 1920, Republican leaders who were on the run began to reorganise their areas under their own initiative with little reference to overarching command structures. They regrouped into more fluid and more ruthless units of committed men from wider geographical areas. These men then operate independently of each other in the so-called famed flying columns. Freed from a cautious and cumbersome command structure, these small groups became resurgent then in the spring of 1921 with the emergence of the Galway Flying Columns, composed of committed young men who had been forced to leave their homes and band together in the open countryside. The columns acted independently of external authority and had little contact with each other or the Republican leadership. During this phase of the campaign, the physical hardship of being on the run, the level of personal commitment, and the obvious dangers to one's family from reprisal attacks by the Crown forces meant that only the most committed young men joined these active service units. By March 1921, where we'll pick up our story with the West Connemara column, the police wrote to Dublin Castle from Galway, the IRA are now confined to the outlying backward areas where Sinn Féin still lives. There is a bitter undercurrent of hatred towards the government and Crown forces. If the present situation was relaxed, however, Sinn Féin would again renew its old sway in a more rigorous and determined manner. It had such a reign of terror, it will take a long period to remove its evil and ruinous effects. So before we go on to explain the exploits of the West Connemara column, there was 2 other columns active in the county of Galway. The North Connemara column was led by Patrick and Levy of Barnajarrag. It was composed of men from the districts from essentially Glenamaddy across to Headford, including Ceylon and surrounding areas. And a second column in South Galway that took refuge in the Slieve Mountains and composed of men from Gort, Kilbeaconty and those surrounding parishes. This column, of course, famously attacked the Crown forces at Ballyturn in Kilbeaconty, killing 4 Crown forces, and also killing, of course, the wife of the district inspector, Eliza Blake. The North Galway column launched a number of lethal attacks also in the village of Milltown, and again the famous battle at Moylaw. So, in terms of the West Connemara column, during December 1920 and early January 1921, the column was actually formed at a meeting of the O'Malley farmhouse, that is the local member of Parliament, Pádraig O'Malley and his brother Tomás, the professor of modern Irish in University College Galway, at Wincherone, 2 miles or so from Leenane, and was attended by West Connemara's leading Republicans. This is North-West Connemara, for those who aren't familiar. There were initially 26 men in the column, P.J McDonnell claimed, later 34, and as we'll see later a number of other men joined, hailing from the districts of Leenane, Rasmuck, Roundstone and Clifden. The commander of the column was P.J McDonnell from Leenane, and he explained the group's early motivation. After being summoned extraordinarily before an audience with the Archbishop on a visit to Clifden, he said later on, the Archbishop, the police and military of England were roaming the country to try and exterminate anyone who stood for the freedom of their country, that they pulled men out of their homes and shot them on the street, sometimes before the eyes of their families, Any man who had a chance of fighting was a fool if he waited to be pulled out and shot without making an effort to fight back. MacDonald was from humble backgrounds. Like all of them, he had to fight and eke out an existence in West Connemara, fluent Irish speaker like most of the column. In fact, more men wanted to join the new unit than could be accommodated. Volunteer Jack Feehan later recalled, actually twice the number of men turned up than what we expected, and each man had his own small contribution with them, such as a shotgun, gelignite and cartridges. They obtained gelignite while working for the Galway County Council. It was sad to turn some of these men away, for we only had accommodation for 20. William King later wrote, the Flying Column then provided itself with blankets and bedding by commandeering them from imperialist families, including that of Lord Sligo at Ashley. They went to Glenmigla for about a week's training, which included scouting, judging distance, aiming, rifle drill, and all sorts of cover from view and fire. There was no target practice, as ammunition was too spare. A couple of key themes emerged there. The lack of ammunition and weapons, the lack of training. Essentially, these men are learning on the go. Ammunition is frequently too valuable to use in training. And a theme of the campaign in the West is ambushes going wrong simply due to the inexperience and lack of training of the men. Lack of commitment is not an issue, but I suppose lack of hardware is. Secondly, the reference to commandeering blankets and bedding from imperialist families, as he terms it. The column largely restrains itself from looting or from commandeering goods from stores and shops, and certainly not from the ordinary poor. They do raid a number of big houses in Screeb Lodge and elsewhere, as they say. They take from those who certainly have it to give, and those whom they have a deep historical grudge against. But the column is not, these are not bandits on the run. These are men who overwhelmingly respect the rights of property and law and order, as you might interpret it. So, as the column could only initially equip less than 30 men, the unit was limited in size and fully mobilised on the 10th of March at Ollianavay at the back of Diamond Mountain, 7 miles or so east of Clifden. The site was chosen as it was within easy striking distance of the town of Clifden, and offered a vantage point over roads leading out of the village. The Connemara landscape posed unique problems, as MacDonald recalled. The roads in Connemara are like the country, bare and bleak, he wrote, with no sheltering walls where shotguns could get within range of the enemy. The Clifden Battalion was responsible for arranging food supplies to be dropped near the unit's base, and the Leenane Company was responsible for keeping the hideaway in battle readiness. The column then was composed, it must be pointed out, with men of very little fighting experience, as had any members generally of guerrilla units. And as MacDonald recalled, until they had their first fight, that with the exception of the quartermaster and myself, not a single man of the column had fired the shot of a service rifle. Food occasionally ran out, and the column experienced several prolonged periods living off tea and the meagre kindness that poor families in isolated communities could offer. The conditions took their toll, and volunteer Jack Feehan later recalled, 4 days under such terrible conditions were even telling on the younger men. In this respect, the women of Connemara play a crucial role. As we'll see, a number of the men are injured and suffer illness, food has to be provided, and various obvious utilities. MacDonald had a remarkable family, including his sisters. Margaret, Delia, Molly and Agnes were in constant contact with their brother's unit, replying information, particularly on the movement of the Crown Forces, providing first aid and so on. And like many of these women, Margaret Feehan actually went on to marry a volunteer from the, she became Margaret Feehan, Margaret MacDonald, from the column. So the column's first attack took place in the town of Clifden on the night of the 16th of March 1921, resulting in the death of Constable G.C. Reynolds and Constable Thomas Sweeney, who died a few days afterwards after his leg was amputated. This attack was carried out in revenge for the execution of Thomas Whelan in Mountjoy Jail the previous day. Whelan was a native of the town and was hanged for his alleged part in the killing of state agents in Dublin on Bloody Sunday in November 1920. Jack Feehan wrote, "We felt it was our duty to avenge his death." Whelan was also believed by his family and others in the district to be innocent of the killing with which he was executed for. On arriving into the village, the unit spotted 6 RIC and interestingly selected just 6 of their own men to attack this group, not seeking to use the overwhelming advantage of numbers. The remainder holding the barracks under fire while the attack took place. Fian explained this move by saying, "It was decided to pick 6 of the best shots. We thought it fair enough, man to man, 6 to 6 enemy." When fire was opened by the group, only 2 RIC were visible and both were severely wounded. The column quickly retreated, but in the hours after the attack, at least 16 houses in the village were burned by Crown forces and hundreds of young men arrested in a roundup. A civilian ex-serviceman, J.J. McDonnell, no relation to P.J McDonnell, was shot dead by the Crown forces after calling to the police station for help in dousing the flames engulfing his father's hotel. So this is quite typical. An IRA attack takes place by a rural IRA unit emerging and disappearing back into the countryside. The Black and Tans arrive in the district and the auxiliaries burn up the area, kill civilians and carry out these brutal reprisals. Following their first attack, it was decided then to move the column to the Man Valley to escape the attentions of police and attempt an attack on Man Police Station, the only other permanent barracks in this area of Connemara. Travelling across the 12 Pins Mountains, the column camped at Glencraft Valley 4 miles west of Leenane before making for the Amalia homestead at Winterowen, halfway between Leenane and Man and 4 miles from the police barracks. Travelling across the mountains with little food was difficult for even the toughest of fighters, and according to Jack Feehan, to be alone and have lost one's way in these mountains on such a night would be court death from exposure. And people, I'm sure, are familiar with the extremely damp climate of the mountainous terrain of West Connemara. After a few days' rest, McDonnell decided that a successful attack on Man Barracks was not a realistic possibility, given the reinforced nature of the building and little ammunition at the unit's disposal. And it was decided instead to try and attack a patrol of RIC men. And the unit departed on the 4th of April, crossing the Man Turk and Urad Mountains to Gurtmore in the Rasmuck district of southwest Connemara, of which of course many of the members would be familiar, hailing from that parish. The column billeted at an ambush spot on the Man crossed to Screeb Road and took some hard-earned rest while local volunteers stood watch. This is a common theme in the operation of columns. When they move through certain areas, that the local volunteers are alerted. These volunteers then seek out safe houses for the men, seek out food, supplies and guard them as they rest. And many of whom will often join the column during the period in their local area. So on the 6th of April then at Screeb, the column attacked a party of 5 RIC travelling by bicycle at a location adjacent to Screeb Church, where they knew the police passed each week to pay the local RIC pensioners. Feehan claimed the ambush was the unit's personal act of revenge for the killing of Galway priest Father Michael Griffin by Crown forces in November 1920. The ambush was a partial success, with one policeman, William Pearson, who was actually a native of New Zealand, killed by the IRA. Another RIC man who lay prone in a ditch following the attack was spared as he begged for mercy, while his comrades escaped from foot, some of whom took shelter in the nearby Screeb Lodge. This is a common theme of not killing men after attacks if they are prone, lying on the ground or unarmed. And the IRA in Galway refrained from this almost entirely throughout the period. Men were shot in gun battles. After the battle ended, men were spared. Volunteer John Staunton wrote about his disappointment with this Screeb attack and the outcome of the ambush, claiming, "One anxious member of the column fired a shot on the impulse of the moment, which upset the whole target." P.J McDonnell was actually incensed, insisting that a member of the group fired too early and actually ruined their chances of inflicting a major blow on the police in southwest Connemara. This again a common theme, ambushes going wrong with young, anxious, nervous, badly trained men not familiar with the use of arms due to the scarcity of arms and ammunition during the training process. After failing to locate the escaped policeman, the column collected the RIC weapons along with several bottles of poteen from the police. McDonnell destroyed most of the bottles, keeping 2, as he claimed, for medicinal purposes. This is a common theme actually. Michael Kilroy, who led the famous West Mayo Flying Column that would have linked up later on with the West Connemara column, actually forbid his men to drink. Also forbid them to swear and to use lewd language. These are very austere leaders. Following the attack, the Crown forces burned, predictably, a number of homes in the vicinity of Scree, including those of volunteer Colm O'Guera, Patrick Pearce's holiday cottage, the cooperative store in Camas, and the home of the local schoolteacher. Volunteer Thomas Gagan, who joined the men after the ambush, appears to have suffered a nervous breakdown after learning of the destruction of his family home, and according to McDonnell, he went completely out of his mind. It took about 4 men to control him and get him upstairs, put him lying on a bed and tying him onto it. We sent to Leenane to get the doctor. He came along and gave him an injection of morphia, which quieted him down. And as we'll see, Gagan was one of a number of men to suffer injuries of this kind from the column. Life then became harder for the group after these attacks, as George Staunton later explained. He said it would be foolish to remain in one place for any length of time, and to look for any kind of comfort was out of the question. Any rest we had was during the daytime, for at night we did all the travelling. Furthermore, a stranger in a strange place would be spotted and talked about if seen by the neighbours, who, I must say this for them, wouldn't wish anything harmful to happen to us. But there was a danger that the wrong person would get to know things, ending up in causing us unpleasantness. Needless to say, needing to send money to GHQ to attain badly needed weapons and ammunition, the unit then decided to levy a tax on local farmers in the district. Feehan later explained, however, we levelled a certain sum on each farmer, knowing that he could afford the amount levied. Some rich pickings were exploited, however, and Kylemore House, people might now be familiar with, which at that time was the home of Colonel Mark Clifden, was raided and weapons and clothes and other items taken. The Amalia family homestead in Wincherowan in northwest Connemara was the scene of the Fallon's final lethal engagement on the 23rd of April. Wincherowan was the well-known homestead of one of the leading families in Connemara and would inevitably raid it. The men were aware of this, of course, and decided for that reason to lay in wait for the inevitable fight. As McDonnell later explained, every man of the column was anxious to have a really good fight and justify our existence as a fighting unit. And I think this is the column really coming to their own. They knew they would be facing possibly overwhelming numbers. They don't know how many RIC auxiliaries and police would turn up, but they wait in the certain knowledge that the enemy would arrive. The attack finally came when police arrived at the home for a routine raid, and the volunteers assumed their pre-planned ambush positions and awaited their orders to open fire. However, once again, a premature shot by the volunteers alerted the police to the attacking party, and the advantage was lost. P.J McDonnell recalled, once again the element of surprise was destroyed despite all my instructions. No man owned up to having accidentally or deliberately discharged his rifle. In driving rain, both parties took cover and engaged in sporadic shooting, neither side able to win a decisive advantage. Remarkably, Jane O'Malley and her 2 young children remained in an outhouse on the property throughout the battle, as over 40 armed men fought a gun battle around her. After almost 12 hours of exchanging fire, and with several men wounded and Constable John Boylan killed, a large line of police lorries became visible on the horizon. As reinforcements dismounted, and with the column almost completely out of ammunition, the IRA slowly fled the district, and police burned the Amalia property and home in reprisal. Reinforcements were alerted by a black and tan managing to jump onto the front windscreen of a passing car and returning home. Another incident in the witness statements concerning the gun battle at Wincherowan, of course, was a traveller man arriving on the scene and almost being shot dead due to his inquisitiveness about what actually was going on. So during the battle, the column made its way. Following the battle, the column made its way to the townland of Townaleen, west of Shanafaragan, near Loch Nafui, a quiet and lonely place, according to Feehan. Camped out among the elements in a canvas tent on the remote side of Killary Harbour, the remaining 18 men at this time received the sacraments from the same priest who administered to the RIC during the previous gun battle. With the days getting longer, the North Connemara district was increasingly patrolled by large convoys of Crown forces, and a spotter plane now patrolled the skies above them. The column's life became more difficult and they were increasingly forced to concentrate their energies on evading capture, destroying bridges, which was a laborious task, carried out with a pick and shovel. Following the battle at Winterowen, William King, a member of the column, was actually captured by the Crown forces, and he later recalled, "I'd come home for one night and was captured at home. I was taken to Mam RIC barrack where I was badly beaten. Shots were fired over my head, pins were driven into my skin, and all sorts of threats used by the RIC to make me tell about the whereabouts of my brother, John C. Towards evening, after a day of torture, one of the RIC named Milan came to me in my cell and said that later on, when all the RIC and Tans would get drunk, he would help me to escape through the back gate. He was as good as his word, and in spite of all the beatings and the torture, I got away from the place very quickly and swore that I would never be caught again." Remarkably, during this period, P.J McDonnell took a day off for the column to get married, along with his comrade Jack Phelan, who acted as his best man. The ceremony took place at Kilmena Church in southwest Mayo on 17th of May, and both men were armed throughout the service with grenades and pistols. Neither groom nor best man, however, got to enjoy the celebrations, and both returned to join that column later that evening. MacDonald actually marries Matilda or Tilly Kilroy, who is the sister of Michael Kilroy, the famed leader of the West Mayo column. And Kilroy and MacDonald would later go on to lead the IRA in that district during the terrible Civil War. During the final weeks of the campaign, the column had 16 rifles and around 200 rounds of ammunition and was firmly on the defensive. Having to guard against being captured, the unit was broken into smaller units in May, with one group under Jack Phelan moving into South Mayo, while the remaining members were forced to levy farmers in North Connemara to purchase badly needed supplies. Phelan recalled at this time, "We had to make demands sternly, as this area was a poor one and the money was hard fought." After receiving ammunition from GHQ at the beginning of June, it was decided to try and join up with the West Mayo column under Michael Kilroy and launch another attack near Leedan. A Navy destroyer lay at berth in Kilroy Harbour, a military aeroplane flew continually overhead, and large convoys of Crown forces now traversed the narrow roads beneath them. The men's religious faith remained important to them during their time on the run, as I alluded to earlier. And Martin Keneally later recalled that following the battles at Winterowen, while in the camp, we expressed a desire to go to confession and receive Holy Communion. The OC arranged with Father Cunningham, who was a priest at Leedan, to come to the house of Michael Wallace, which was just across the narrow inlet of the bay that I mentioned earlier. His house was always at our disposal and was used as a depot for receiving food, messages, etc. while we were in the area. He had two sons in the column, Peter and Patrick Wallace. Next night, Father Cunningham came at midnight. We all got confession and received Holy Communion. Peter Wallace and another man then ferried the priest across the narrow channel and escorted him to Leedan. The column's final days in the run then were spent in the northwestern hills of Connemara, and the unit were at a spot called Glenamidla with a group of Mayo officers when the news of the truce on the 11th of July that ended the War of Independence arrived. Jack Phelan recalled, "There we received a splendid welcome from our friends and were united with them amid tears of joy, thanking God that we were safe and happy." The hardship of fighting in such inhospitable territory had taken its toll on the health of a number of the men. 2 volunteers were invalided with severe burns from boiling water. William Keneally had shot himself accidentally in the leg. Colm O'Guara had suffered facial paralysis. Thomas Gagan had experienced a breakdown, and a number of men had experienced a variety of other less serious injuries. Despite their sincere personal religious convictions then, the column faced considerable clerical condemnation. In the height of the conflict in March 1921, Archbishop Thomas Gilmartin of the Tuam Diocese expressed his solidarity with the people of Galway in their feelings of horror and indignation at the actions of the Crown forces. However, the Archbishop went on to warn his flock against channeling their anger into support for the volunteers, as he said, "What is called the IRA may contain the flower of Irish youth, but they have no authority from the Irish people or from any moral principle to wage war against unequal forces with the consequence of terror, arson and death to innocent people." In terms of their military struggle with the Crown forces, there was some disagreement as to how strong or weak a position the IRA were in when the truce was announced on the 11th of July. P.J McDonnell recalled, "I cannot say that we went wild at the news. To say we were stunned would be nearer the mark, until it began to sink in that the British had been forced by men just like us, fighting all over the country, to agree to a truce." In fact, throughout 1920, it was far from clear who was winning the battle between the Crown forces and the volunteers in Galway. But the truce was certainly viewed as a welcome return to normality by most, and for Republicans as a chance simply for a well-earned rest. It was widely believed by the West Connemara leadership and others that peace would not last long, negotiations would break down, and violence would erupt once more. The retrospective notion that the military stalemate of the summer of 21 represented an IRA victory would have been greeted with scepticism. And you see a problem at this time that Ernie O'Malley, the IRA organisers, and others express that if the men of the columns come out from the mountainsides and down into their home districts, they'll easily be identified. In many ways, they will lose their cutting edge, and the IRA would essentially be neutralised by the truce. In terms of the membership of the West Connemara Column and other active service units, the young men and women who fought against the Crown forces in Galway and elsewhere were not adventure seekers who remained in the organisation for any personal kudos or social gain. The dangers that faced by IRA members who were willing to take part in these attacks from July 1920 on, with the coming of the Black and Tans to the west, were very considerable, and Republican activity offered no prospect of social or economic reward. In order to remain active for a significant length of time, these young people needed to remain free of parental control to facilitate long periods of time away from their families. From July 1920 onwards, only the most determined young people, generally without the burden of property, dependence, and the constraints of standard working commitments, remained in the fight. So before I go on to the aftermath, just an overview of who the members of the column were. Well, in the military pensions archives, the West Connemara Brigade submitted in 1934 the membership of the column. There were 26 members listed by P.J McDonnell in his witness statement. But the Brigade Committee lists 34 members of the column on the 10th of March 1921 when it formed. 12 of these men were from Leenane: P.J McDonnell, John Feehan, Martin Keneally, John King, Michael Joyce, Willie King, Peter Wallace, Patrick Wallace, John Faherty, John Coyne, John King, and Thomas Coyne. Pádraig O'Malley, of course, was from nearby Winterowen. From the Clifden and the Balnaboy district, we had 11 members: Richard Joyce, Gerald Bartley, Paul Bartley, Christy Breen, Thomas Madden, Martin Joyce, John Gavin, William Keneally, Thomas Burke, John J. Keneally, and John King. From the Roundstone district, we had 6 members: Dennis Keane, John King, John Keneally, Michael Conroy, Stephen Mannion, and John Dundas. And from the Tully Cross district outside of Clifden, we had 3 members: Patrick MacDonald, Lawrence O'Toole, and Patrick Keane. And finally, William Keneally came originally from Westport, County Mayo. 7 members actually joined the column on the 4th of April 1921 from the Rossmuck district: Colm O'Guera, Patrick Nee, Michael O'Donnell, and Patrick Gagan. 3 members joined also on the 4th of April from Kilmilkin: Charles O'Malley, Eamon O'Malley, and Tomás O'Malley, of course the Professor of Modern Irish at UCG. 6 additional members then finally joined on the 1st of May from the Carnamona district. There was Michael Brown, Michael Joyce, and Michael Coyne. From Lettermore there was George Staunton. From Carna district there was Michael Layden, and from the Man district there was Tomás O'Malley. Disbanded following the truce and subsequent treaty, almost every single member of the West Connemara Flying Column went on to take the anti-treaty IRA side during the Civil War, and Clifden was to be the scene of intense fighting on several occasions between the West Connemara Brigade, including many members of the column, and the National Army. The brigade at this point linked up with Michael Kilroy and Thomas Maguire in West and South Mayo, making the district a Republican stronghold. During the truce, P.J McDonnell continued to serve as a full-time IRA officer, and March 1922 became the Divisional Vice Commanding Officer of the anti-treaty IRA's 4th West Division. During the Civil War, he took part in a number of engagements with the National Army forces in counties Galway and Mayo, including at Clifden in October 22, at Newport in November, and at Delphi in December. He was captured and imprisoned by the National Army on the 24th of May 1923, technically after the Civil War had ended, and was tried and sentenced to death, later commuted to penal servitude. And he was held until July of 1924 in jails at Galway, Tintown and Hare Park internment camps. He actually died in 1967, P.J McDonnell, as an unrepentant Republican in his home in Newcastle near the university at age 75 in Galway City. Gerald Bartley, who was actually a member of the column, was born in an RIC barracks, the son of a police sergeant, went on to become a Fianna Fáil TD between 1922 and 27, and again between 27 and 65. He originally went to school in Clifden before being educated in O'Connell schools in Dublin, and was actually a member of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA before returning to his home district. Like many of the column's senior members, he took the anti-treaty side during the Civil War and was imprisoned in Galway, Belfast and Dublin. Bartley actually subsequently served as Minister for Minister for the Gaeltacht in 1959 and Minister for Defence in 1961. In terms of Pádraig O'Malley, then, who was one of the most senior members of the column, O'Malley had been elected to Dáil Éireann in 1918, again in 1921 and 22. He was one of the very few members of the column to accept the treaty, and he was actually appointed last Ceann Comhairle of Dáil Éireann in 1922, a post he retained until 1927. From May to June 1922, he was actually one of the 10-man committee comprised of 5 pro and 5 anti-treaty TDs charged with averting the Irish Civil War. He was a member of a subcommittee formed to draft the constitution then of the Cumann na Gael party in September 1922. However, of course, on the 7th of December 1922, he was shot in the spine outside the Ormond Hotel on Dublin's Quays by the anti-treaty IRA, with Sean Hales, the Cork Republican, killed in the same incident. It was believed that O'Malley was the Republicans' intended victim, owing to his vote in favour of the Special Powers resolution earlier that month that brought in the legal framework allowing the executions of Irish Republicans during the Civil War. What's significant about the shooting of O'Malley is his health never recovers, but secondly, 4 men, of course, famously are taken from their cells that night and executed under a new, essentially extrajudicial summary justice in Mountjoy. Liam Mellows, who O'Malley would have known quite well, also a TD and also had served a number of years in Galway. Dick Barrett of West Cork, Joe McKelvey of West Belfast, and of course Rory O'Connor, the Dublin IRA leader. In 1926, together with Professor William O'Guinness, actually O'Malley formed a new constitutional Republican party, Clan Éireann. It sought the abolition of the oath and the revision of the boundary agreement and the pursuance of protectionism. He failed to be elected actually in June 1927. He went on actually to be a Fianna Fáil senator and chaired the United Farmers Protection Association. He actually remained a senator until after World War II in 1946. He lived in Meath and he died actually age 68. O'Malley was significantly older. O'Malley was born in in the late 18s. He was 20 years older than most of the other men he fought actually alongside. So while a number of the men did have prominent political careers, 3 in fact, the other original 34 members, life was very different. Having taken the Republican side in the Civil War, having come from the very poorest districts of the entire island of Ireland and being Irish speaking, at least 12 of the original 34 members of the West Connemara column were forced to immigrate to the USA and England in the preceding years, and others to Dublin and elsewhere in Ireland, making a total of 16 of that original group forced to leave Connemara to find work. This figure contained in the brigade report is actually an underrepresentation. Martin Keneally, John Keneally and Thomas Coyne had to immigrate to England. John C. King, John King, Martin Joyce, John Gavin, William Keneally, John Burke, Michael Conroy, John Dundas and Patrick Keane immigrated to the United States. Christy Breen became a lay member of the Jesuit order and moved with his family to Dublin, and James King moved to Kildare, and of course Pádraig O'Malley never returned to Connemara. In this respect, if there was a glory in fighting the West Connemara Brigade, it would become a strange kind of glory. William King, a member of the column, later wrote, "A few days before the truce, Pádraig O'Malley received a summons to Dublin for a meeting with Dáil Éireann. Remember, Billy said, if ever anything comes of this truce with England, I'll see that all my comrades will be looked after." But that's as far as promises went. Some of my old comrades of the IRA are now gone to their reward. Some are in exile and scattered to the four winds of the world. They were fine boys and loyal comrades, but the cause for which they fought is still there with the fight unfinished. I pray God to have mercy on my dead comrades, and I pray that Ireland will have her freedom, as Pearse wanted it. Not merely free, but Gaelic as well. Not Gaelic merely, but free as well. Vermont.